We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Beis Amid Beis Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 32b. This daf is sponsored by David and Ariella Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amid or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amid, the Gemara brought a brisa which said that worn-out tefillin cannot be used to make a mezuzah, and that is because one is not allowed to go down from something that is a higher level of Kedusha to something that is a lower level of Kedusha. Tefillin is a higher level of Kedusha than mezuzah, and therefore, again, the worn-out tefillin cannot be used for mezuzah. But the Gemara asked on that implies that technically speaking, the worn-out tefillin could be used for mezuzah, but the problem is that tefillin is written on klaf, and mezuzah is written on duchsustus. Klaf and duchsustus are made by taking the hide of the animal and you split that hide of the animal, the outer part, that's called the klaf, and then the inner part, that's called the duchsustus. So how could it be that one can use worn-out tefillin for mezuzah? Again, the tefillin's on klaf, the mezuzah is on duchsustus. It doesn't seem to be possible. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara asked that that's just a lechatchila. Lechatchila, tefillin should be written on klaf, and lechatchila, mezuzah should be written on duchsustus, but it doesn't have to be that way, and that's why it is possible to use the worn-out tefillin for mezuzah, because again, the tefillin are written on klaf, and really, klaf can be used for mezuzah as well. But the Gemara asked, doesn't it say in a brisa that shina, that if you deviate, if you don't do exactly in this fashion, that it's no good? And the Gemara said that's just talking about tefillin. By tefillin, it must be on klaf. There can be no deviation. But with regards to mezuzah, it doesn't have to be on duchsustus. It can be in klaf as well. But then the Gemara asked, we have another brisa that says shina bazeh uvazeh pasul. Deviation by both tefillin and mezuzah is going to be disqualified. That sounds like mezuzah has to be on duchsustus. And the Gemara says, no, actually, the brisa which says shina bazeh uvazeh pasul, it's all talking about tefillin, but it means as follows. It means that with regards to the tefillin, it has to be on klaf, and it specifically has to be on the klaf b'makom basar. That means the area of the klaf that faced the flesh, that faced the body of the animal, because again, they would take the hide of the animal and they would split it, and the outer part of the hide, that was for klaf, but you specifically have to write it on the side that's b'makom basar, that's facing the basar, and so the brisa means if you do it on the klaf b'makom sar, the outer part facing the hair, that's problematic, and then when it says shina, that's shina bazeh, and then shina bazeh uvazeh, the other problem is if it's dechasvino ad duchsustus b'makom basar, let's say he writes it on the duchsustus b'makom basar, that's also a problem, because again, klaf specifically has to be on the tefillin specifically has to be on the klaf b'makom basar. It can't be on the klaf b'makom sar, and it can't be on the duchsustus at all. Really, that's what the Gemara means to say. And so therefore, in any case, again, the point is that the only time there's an absolute requirement is by the tefillin, that has to be on klaf, and specifically klaf b'makom basar. But by mezuzah, it's just a lechatchila, but by mezuzah, it's okay. If it's not on duchsustus, it's fine. If it's on the klaf of tefillin. And the Gemara continues and says, V'iba Yisem, if you want, we can say as follows, that shina bazeh uvazeh tanoihi, that actually it's a machlokas tanoim, whether there's an absolute requirement over here. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, shina bazeh uvazeh pasul, it says that if there's any deviation by this and this, meaning by the tefillin and mezuzah, it is disqualified. So there's a Tana that says it's disqualified. But Rav Acha machshir mishum Rabbi Achoy Rabbi Chanina v'amri la mishmei de Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Chanina. Again, there's a Tana over here, Rav Acha, that says it's kosher, and therefore, again, there's a machlokas tanoim, whether deviation is okay or not. And therefore, we are going to say that the brisa, which says that theoretically worn-out tefillin can be used for mezuzah, that would follow the Tana that holds that in a situation where the mezuzah is not made out of duchsustus, it is still going to be okay. The deviation is not going to pose a problem. But the Gemara still continues and asks, Hamorida nosin, but again, the brisa implies that if one is allowed to go to a lower kedusha, then the worn-out tefillin can be used for mezuzah. But there's another technical problem. V'haboy sirtut, but there's a requirement of sirtut. What the Gemara means to say is that by mezuzah sirtut, scoring the parchment, which is etching lines into the parchment before writing on the parchment, is required, and that's not true by tefillin. So again, how can you use the worn-out tefillin for mezuzah? As the Gemara continues, the Amar Rav Menyume bar Chilkiya, Amar Rav Chama bar Gurya, Amar Rav, that Rav Menyume bar Chilkiya said, that Rav Chama bar Gurya said, that Rav said, Kol mezuzah she'ena misurtetes psula. If a mezuzah doesn't have those lines etched in, then it is possible, it is disqualified. Rav Minyamin bar Chilkiya didei Amar, and Rav Minyamin bar Chilkiya himself says, Sirtut shel mezuzah halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that again, the scoring of a mezuzah, those etched lines are required by halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So again, how is it possible that you can use the worn out tefillin parchment for mezuzah? And Rashi explains, v'haboy sirtut kidim mefarish l'kamanas. The Gemara will explain as it goes on. Uv'tefillin lo eshkechon, the boy sirtut. We don't find by tefillin that sirtut is required. And the Gemara continues and answers, Tanoihi, that's actually a machlokas Tanoim, whether mezuzah requires sirtut. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer Mishum Rabbeinu. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Mishum Rabbeinu tefillin u'mezuzos nechtavos shalom and aksav. That tefillin and mezuzah, they can be written without copying from a written text. Ve'ein tzrichos sirtut, and sirtut is not required. And the Gemara continues, V'hilchasa, now the halacha is tefillin lo boy sirtut, that tefillin do not require sirtut, u'mezuzah boy sirtut, and mezuzah does require sirtut. V'idi nechtavos shalom and aksav, and both of them can be written without copying from a text. My time, and what's the reason for that? Migras Gurisin, these are things that people are fluent in anyhow, so there is no need to copy from a text. And Rashi explains, Migras Gurisin Rehutim Heim Befi Choladim, again, people are fluent in the parshios of tefillin and the parshios of mezuzah. Vein Toen Behem, people won't make a mistake. Hilkach Ein Sarach La'atika Mi Sefer Acher, therefore there's no need to copy them from another sefer. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chelbo said, Anoch Chazisei l'Rav Huna, I saw Rav Huna to have a Yosef Apuria de Sefer Torah. He was sitting on a bed that the Sefer Torah was upon that bed as well. V'chaf l'chad ha'ara, so he turned over a jug on the ground. V'yanachol Sefer Torah, and he placed the Sefer Torah on there. V'hadar Yosef b'mita, and then he sat on the bed. Kasavar, because he held Osir leishev agabe mita she Sefer Torah munachol. It's forbidden to sit on a bed that the Sefer Torah is on that bed. And the Gemara continues, Upliga de Rava bar bar Chana. This argues on Rava bar bar Chana. The Yomar Rava bar bar Chana, Rabbi Yochanan, because Rava bar bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Mutter leishev al gabe mita she Sefer Torah munach aleh. It is mutter, it's permitted to sit on a bed that a Sefer Torah is upon. Vim l'chashcha adam lomar. And if a person whispers to you saying, Ma'aseh Rebbe Lazar shalya yoshev al amita, that there was an incident with Rebbe Lazar, that he was sitting on a bed, v'nizkar she Sefer Torah munach aleh, and he remembered that a Sefer Torah was placed on there, V'nishmat v'yoshav agabe karka, and he got off and he sat on the ground. V'dome k'mishay kisho nachash, and he acted as though he was bit by a snake. So Hasam over there in that particular story, that's not exactly what happened. Sefer Torah agabe karka have it. What actually happened over there was the Sefer Torah was on the ground. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Kosva igeres psula. If a mezuzah is written as a letter, it is pasul, it is disqualified. And Rashi explains, Kosva igeres below sirtut. It means to say that he writes the mezuzah without sirtut, without scoring, without etching in those lines. V'lo diktik b'chaseros v'yaseros, and he's not careful about the missing or extra letters. Ki geres bi'alma, as if it's just a mere letter. So again, that's going to be pasul, that's disqualified. And the Gemara continues, my time, what's the reason? Asya ksiva mi sefer. We learn xereshava ksiva from sefer. And Rashi explains ksiva uchsavtem al mezuzos. By mezuzah it says uchsavtem. V'chasav lo sefer krisus. It also says v'chasav lo sefer krisus. That's by a gerisha. Inami ksov zos zikaron basefer. Or maybe we're learning from the pasuk of ksov zos zikaron basefer. But the point is ma sefer boy diktuk af mezuzah boy diktuk. Just like by sefer it has to be exacting, so to a mezuzah it needs to be written in an exact manner. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, and Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Tola b'makil psula, if one hangs the mezuzah from a rod, it is pasul, it is disqualified. My time, what's the reason? Bisharecha bo'inon, it needs to be in your gates. And Rashi explains, Tala lemezuzah al ha-pesach. One hangs the mezuzah on the doorway, b'makil, using a rod, that is disqualified again because it needs to be bisharecha, it needs to actually be in the doorpost. And the Gemara continues, Tanya nami hachi, we have a brisa like this as well. Tala b'makil, again, if he hangs it on a rod, or sheinicha achar hadelas, or he places it behind the door, sakana, that poses a danger, we'll see Rashi in a moment, ve'ein ba mitzvah, and there's no mitzvah fulfilled in that situation. Shall base Munbaz HaMelech, in the house of Munbaz HaMelech, hayu osin befunda kosei and kain, zeicher lemezuzah. They did this in their inns where there really wasn't an obligation of mezuzah, so they just hung it on a rod, and they did that zeicher lemezuzah. The reason why that was okay was because there was no real technical obligation over there. They just did that as a zeicher to the mitzvah of mezuzah. And Rashi explains, Sheinicha achori hadelas, again, if it's placed behind the door, Shekava bekosel, if it's affixed in the wall, achori hadelas, behind the door, that also is not good. And the Gemara then said, Sakon, it's a danger. What that means is min hamazikim, it's a danger from that which causes damage, from the shadim, the demons. Shein habayis mishtamer, but the point is that the house is not going to be protected if it's not placed the proper way. Ad sheyikve'ena b'tsuras hapesach kilchas, it has to be placed again in the doorway according to the proper halacha. And then it said that in the base munbaz hamelach, so then hayuosin befinda kosei and Cain, they did this in their inns. Pundak hainu bayis shalonin bo over derachim. This refers to a house that when people are traveling, they stay in baderach on the road. Vein chayavin b'mezuzah. The point is there's no real obligation of mezuzah in these situations. Delav diras kevahu. It's not a permanent residence. Kedetanya lekamon ba'atchelas, like we're going to learn later on. Hadar bepundike beretz Yisrael kol shloshim yom. That if one is just there for 30 days or less, pater min hamezuzah, so then it's exempt from mezuzah. V'shal beis munbaz hamelach keshayu mahalchim b'derech. And so those who were part of the household of the king of the king Munbaz, when they were on the road, nosin mezuzas imohim, they would carry mezuzas with them. V'tol nosan b'pundak b'makil, and they would just hang using a rod. They would hang the mezuzah in the inn ad haboker until morning. Zeicher mezuzah was like a remembrance to the mitzvah mezuzah. Lefi shelo hayu darin liolam, since they weren't there permanently. Diras keva, it wasn't there in a permanent fashion. Elahole chaya meir leir b'malchusa, they were just traveling from one city to the next, so that's why they did that. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, and Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Mitzvah lahanicha b'soch halolo shel Pesach. It is a mitzvah to place the mezuzah within the airspace of the door. And Rashi explains, B'soch cholol hapesach v'lo mibachutz, not on the outside. Again, it has to be within the door frame. The Gemara says, Pshita, well, isn't that obvious? Bisharecha amar Rachmana, the pasuk says, Bisharecha. Rashi explains, Pshita Bisharecha ksiv dahainu makom skiras hashar. That's the area where the gate closes. That's where you have to place a mezuzah. And the Gemara continues, Salkadai Tachamina, one might have thought, Hoel v'yamar Rava, since Rava says, Mitzvah lahanicha, it's a mitzvah to place it. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph.